Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you, Dean, for organizing today's briefing. I'm going to start with a story. A couple of years ago, when I was serving at the Commerce Department, I had the opportunity to travel to several of the countries that we're going to talk to you about today. Actually, all three of them, Colombia, Korea, and Panama. But I want to tell the story about my trip to Colombia. It was in 2007, about 4 years ago, shortly after the Colombia Agreement was signed. And I was accompanying Secretary Gutierrez, then the Secretary of Commerce, and a bipartisan congressional delegation led by Congressman David Dreyer and Congressman Greg Meeks. And we were going to Medellin, Colombia. And I had told my wife I was going to Colombia. I didn't volunteer that I was going to Medellin, which had been the capital of the drug trade until fairly recently. And so we land at the airport in Medellin, and we're getting off the plane, and at the bottom of the steps on the tarmac is a line of armored white SUVs and a bunch of Colombian motorcycle cops ready to escort us into the city. And all I could think of was the scene from the movie Clear and Present Danger. And that's the movie where Harrison Ford is at the CIA, and he goes to Colombia, and he gets off the plane, and he gets into an armored white SUV, just like the one that was there. And there's a Colombian motorcycle cop, just like the one who was there. And driving into the city, they get ambushed by Colombian narco-terrorists. And I think maybe the members of Congress, who were usually very talkative, were having the same thoughts, because as we're riding into the city, no one was saying a thing. And yet as we got into the city and it was getting close to dark, you saw some interesting things. You saw busy restaurants, sidewalk cafes filled with people, families walking with their children in parks, excellent infrastructure, and it was certainly not what I had expected. It was not the Colombia of the movies. And so what I hope you get from today's briefing is that the countries that we're talking about are not the caricatures that we have in our minds. If you ask people about Colombia, they'll think of drugs or the FARC terrorists, or maybe they'll raise issues about violence against labor unionists. A lot has changed in Colombia just in the 4 years since this agreement was signed, and even more since 2002, when the United States began a bipartisan program called Plan Colombia to help raise Colombia out of poverty and move it away from drug trafficking. You could say the same about Panama. You could certainly say the same about Korea. When I worked in the telecommunications industry 20 years ago, the story of Korea was all about a completely protected market. It was about having annual fights over access to the telecommunications market of Korea Telecom. Now Korea is signing free trade agreements with countries all over the world. It has opened itself to the world much more so than other countries in East Asia, such as Japan. These agreements are groundbreaking for the technology industry in many respects. You may not know, IBM is largely now a software and services company. 85% of our revenue comes from software and services. We're not the PC company that maybe you knew of in the past. These agreements are great on services, on e-commerce, on cross-border transfer of data. They have groundbreaking provisions that go beyond even previous U.S. free trade agreements. For example, one area that I want to talk about is the cross-border movement of data. Some of you may have heard of controversies about whether or not you can use a BlackBerry in places like Saudi Arabia or even India. There are regulations and restrictions that some countries are placing on where data is stored, where the servers are that your data is located. It has to be within a national border. Any of you who've used cloud services, such as Yahoo Mail or Gmail, know that your data is off somewhere in the cloud, but you don't know the location physically of where your data is on some server. It's important in the world of cloud computing that we be able to move data freely across borders. And these free trade agreements have groundbreaking provisions that ensure that countries in the future cannot impose national restrictions on where data is stored or where it's moved. That's just one example of how these agreements break new ground. We're going to hear a lot more from my fellow panelists today, who I'm pleased to introduce now. You're hearing from the leading companies in the American technology industry, and you're hearing from experts in the trade field. We're going to hear from my friend Dorothy Dwoskin from Microsoft, who has served as a trade negotiator at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative for many years. We're going to hear from Jennifer Mulvaney from Hewlett Packard, who's going to talk to us in particular about the process by which these agreements will be dealt with in the Congress. Jennifer handled congressional affairs at USTR during the consideration of a number of free trade agreements in the 2000s. We're going to hear from Jennifer Sanford from Cisco, who's going to focus in particular on the great benefits that these agreements have for the telecommunications industry. And finally, from my colleague Greg Slater from Intel, who's going to focus on issues such as standards, competition policy, IP licensing, and so forth. But we'll start with some comments from Dorothy Dwoskin of Microsoft, who's going to focus, I expect, in particular, on the excellent intellectual property protections in these agreements. Thank you.